Welcome to Anyhoney.
And the Newt. Welcome to another episode of Anyhoney and the Newt. We've been talking for season 3 about experience and subjectivity, and we've discussed a bunch of different aspects of what that means. And the goal has been to get to this season finale about decision making. Anthony's got a lot of experience and interest in learning. We have an interest in artificial intelligence that we hope to have a season about soon. And to lay the groundwork for that, we had to understand what it meant for intelligence. Sorry, had a nice little bug fly in my nose.
And I see you swatted that bug away. What made you choose that decision?
Oh, great segue. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, so we wanted to introduce one last component before we got into decision making, and that's habits. And so that's a very good, that was a reaction I had, maybe not a habit, but what is the difference between like an impulse or instinctive reaction and something like a habit? And what's the difference between like an addiction or obsession and what we might call second nature?
Would you say you have an addiction to swatting flies?
No, I don't obsess about doing it. In fact, I would probably rather not do it. But it's like it happens before I realize that I'm doing it. So I don't feel like I'm deciding to swat at the fly.
That's an interesting choice of words there. Like, I would totally agree with your assessment, right? Like, I don't think anybody... they probably do at some point choose to swat something. I would never use the word like obsess over that unless you have like a Tourette tick kind of thing and you just like swat at the air, which is a totally different thing. But the way that you just characterized that, I found very interesting. What was the exact word that you said at the very end?
Well, I mentioned about contrasting with second nature. But I don't think that's what you're referring to.
If only I could rewind the recording. Because I already forgot the word. Anyway, moving along. I'm going to leave this part of the outtakes in the recording because this is actually like a funny behind the scenes. You can see how the decision-making process affects us in real time.
Yeah.
And actually, speaking of the decisions, when I record, when I'm editing, I have to like make this decision as to whether something is keepable or not. And a lot of times, like, I kind of edit out the stuff where I start stuttering because I just don't like it, and you're so well composed. And usually, that's my perception of it. So there's a bit of a perception there too. But, last episode was pretty heavily edited, I should say. And we kind of, planned it that way. We had, like, marks where we were talking through some stuff, and we just had to pause and think about the next thing. So I just wanted to illustrate that for our viewers and listeners.
Yeah. And first of all, I'm very grateful that you do the editing because I don't really want to have to make those decisions. But it is funny then that I can stutter and stammer and you wouldn't necessarily pick up on it, and I would be like, oh gosh, I'm such a mumbling idiot. We're so judgmental of ourselves. And I think that maybe that's something that goes into this discussion about instinct and habit. We talked last session about reflection and this fact that thinking can think about thinking. I think we're often focused on how did I come off or what am I thinking or doing. Like we're thinking of it in an arch of a story, of a narrative. And so analyzing that story and trying to bring coherence and consistency to that story, or maybe adventure and randomness, whatever it is that we're wanting to craft our story around, I think tends to make us focus on our own foibles and glitches and so on.
Yeah, you in talking about that, you reminded me that in like the decision-making process, I'll just characterize this around the editing, right, because it's top of mind. When I first started doing it for us, I would get stuck in these like decision-making loops where I'm just like, do I cut this? Do I not cut this? Let me listen to the next part. Let me re-listen to the beginning part and see if it makes sense within that narrative. Or, and I would just like kind of obsess over the decision-making part itself. Not necessarily like whether like it's valid or not. But I would just kind of sit there and like constantly go back and forth in this loop of should I cut this part out or not. And eventually I trained myself off of it, and maybe it's more habituated now because I can make these decisions much faster than I was able to in the beginning. Like more or less after a recording, I know, okay, there was this part that probably should be cut. The rest of it, like there might be some stutters or whatever. We can leave that stuff. It's totally fine. Like nobody really cares about that sort of thing. And honestly, I don't really care either. And also in that way, I was able to use evaluation to make my decisions faster. So like, do I care about how perfect the clip is, or would I rather just be done with the editing process faster? So there's a little bit of a balancing act there.
No, that's really good. And what's coming out of that is like you identified your values and your criteria, and then it helped you to speed up the evaluative process. So you were applying the norms more quickly, right? And the reflection gave you a greater grasp of what it is that you were trying to accomplish. So you were able to weed out some of the alternatives, because there's a lot of different ways that you could edit these videos. You could do it for comedic effect. You could do to make them more didactic. You could try to make them more exciting. You know, all the different ways that you could craft the video based on the material that you have to work with. So I think it's really interesting when we talk about decision making, all those different components that we've already been highlighting throughout the season, showing how they all come together and interplay in that process.
You just blew my mind when you talked about the applying values, because I had never thought about decision making as applying values at different, I guess, rates of speed. And like it does make sense. It definitely makes sense. I mean, how do you go from the example that we were going to introduce when we started breaking into this before I sidetracked us was making decisions on a basketball court. You're playing the game, right? You for instance get the rebound, and we play together a lot, so I'll just use this. I run down the court and you're bringing the ball up to try and get a fast break opportunity, and you have me, you have yourself, you have another player maybe down in the post or out on the wing, and you make this decision of where to pass the ball, or do you take it to the rim yourself? And there's probably like 5 or 6 different decisions you can make in that instant. And if you were to answer that question as quickly as possible, what do you do?
Yeah, outlet pass. I look to see which one of you is closer to the basket, or which one is I've got a clearer path to throw the ball to you.
You're a passer by nature.
Yeah. But I don't trust my own shot, and if also you're already breaking down the court, you're going to get there faster. The ball always travels faster by air than by dribble.
And you don't. Would you say that you like think through all this stuff while you're playing, or like how does that process come about?
Great question. I mean, so just to answer it quickly, no, I don't really. That's just what I do. I turn, I grab the ball, and I take one dribble while I analyze where everybody's at. And if I can launch it down the court, let's do it. If I have to manage for the defense, then let's slow it down probably and get one of you guys to come back up and help with a pick or ball handling. But I didn't always, like, that isn't how I started playing when I was 7 and 8, right? Like, I had to learn how to dribble and not lose the ball. And so I would very much concentrate on dribbling the ball in front of me, which meant that I wasn't looking for someone to pass to. And then I discovered how much I loved passing. And so then I was always looking for the pass, and sometimes would make risky, really poorly advised passes because I thought, if this works, it's going to be brilliant. And then, get a lot of turnovers. So there was, like, throughout the process of learning to play the game, I would start with skills until I had those masters. And then I would start with strategy until I had, like, common game plans. And then I would start on innovating, like trying to improvise in the situation, right? But those only got built on after I had already layered the earlier habits and skills. And that's why I wanted to bring up habits before we got too far into this.
Yeah, and you talked a lot about the learning process there, which I think when we think about decision making, typically people don't really bring learning into it. They think of it just as like, yes or no, binary choice, or maybe there's multiple choices, but we don't ever think about how one comes to accept that one choice might be better than another choice, or maybe like it normally would be better, but not in this instant because of context or whatever your values are, right? For instance, when I was learning to play basketball, I would obsess over trying to dribble without looking at my hands, but I didn't ever think I could get there. I was like, I just don't understand how I'm ever going to get to play without looking at my hands. And it was actually the same for typing. I never thought that I'd go from like the 2-finger typing to being able to type without looking at the keys.
Huh.
But I think one thing that you talked about there was like pushing on innovation, even if you can't do it, because it's in that you learn different experiences of how like the ball moves, where players are going to be, and you make that bad choice there, and maybe like players on the court kind of get mad. They're like, oh, I was open on the wing, why didn't you see that? But at the same time, you're making yourself a better player by knowing, one, now you have outside feedback that wasn't the best decision. Two, the ball didn't get to where it was trying to go, so you know you need to adjust where you're throwing it, or maybe make the read a little bit faster, or track the player better. There's a lot of different things you could do there, and it's in that being able to make a bad decision that you realize that it's not a good decision.
Yeah, that's really good. And I do want to point out, I think there's a difference. So you learn a skill, and we talk about the fundamentals. Tim Duncan was just known as Mr. Fundamental, right? He knew how to shoot a ball off the backboard and use the angles. He knew how to move his feet to position his defender away from being able to block his shot. And he learned these skills through repeated practice. There's a lot of repetition involved. And we talked last episode that repetition isn't the same thing as reflection. Winding gears, doing the same thing over and over again isn't necessarily learning. But there is something about learning that facilitates turning something that was initially complex into, I'll call it second nature. It seems easy. We don't even have to think about it. Like, when's the last time that you really thought about taking your next step? Right? It was probably when the train was treacherous, or where there was some kind of obstacle in your normal everyday life. You're just like, I'm going over there, and you just do it, right? You don't think about taking the next step. But when you were 1 year old, that was a very different story.
Yeah, and if you think about the walking analogy, the only time you think about taking the next step is when you trip. You're like, oh, I better not do that again. Let me make sure I'm watching where my feet are going for a little bit. And it's go ahead.
Well, just real quick, I think there is, at least for me, and I think it's true for others, hiking might require paying attention to your next step, right? Like, just knowing that the ground is uneven and has loose gravel, like, you become more conscientious about things that you might take at second nature. So when something becomes second nature, it doesn't mean that you can't reflect on it or bring it to the forefront of your thought. You just don't have to, which allows you to do more with your mental activity.
Yeah, that's a great comparison, because as you were saying that, I was thinking, just like I said with basketball, right? Watching my hands while I'm dribbling, maybe I'm just a horribly inexperienced hiker, but I realize that every time I hike, I'm actually like looking at my feet the whole time because the ground is so uneven. And I don't know if, I'm sure like super experienced hikers who like hike Everest and come back alive, like when they do like a basic trail in like the Sandias with just a little gravel, they're not even paying attention to their feet. But on definitely more unsure footing, they probably are much more aware of what's going on.
You should ask Maps about how much she cares, watches. I know she cares about her next step, making sure it's a safe step, but I wonder how much she has to pay attention to those steps.
Special edition, special guest for the next episode.
Right. So we could, just want to throw out habit and habituation there, and just point out there's differences in kind, right? We talk about addiction where maybe somebody has a particular goal or outcome that they want to achieve, maybe a feeling or a chemical reaction or whatever, and fall into patterns of behavior to achieve that outcome. I'm not necessarily sure that's the same thing as developing a skill, right? In developing a skill, you're thinking about the how and the why, and you do it enough times that you don't have to think about every step. Your body develops its muscle memory and its familiarity with how that motion goes and so on. Whereas with addiction, it almost feels like you're so fixed on the outcome that the behavior happens without you really thinking about it. It's like the opposite of deliberation.
Yeah, I would say the skill development with addiction typically comes in the form of trying to get away with it, right? Hiding, alcohol, for instance, around the house, and people not noticing, or being so good at masking that you're not sober, that part, like, probably you could characterize as a skill, although a very destructive one.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's different focus maybe than the how to achieve your whatever it is that the outcome that you're seeking.
Right. And then you mentioned compulsion and obsession and impulsion earlier. Would you mind just characterizing those?
Yeah, it's really difficult to distinguish, what is the me that thinks and what are the thoughts that are impressed upon me. So just talking about compulsion is going to get into some murky waters about, does my body make me do something? What does that mean? What's the difference between me and my body? Right. So I'm going to just set aside the question of what is the self, who is the agent involved, and just loosely say that there does seem to be a difference between feeling like I have to do something and I have to do it this way versus having made a decision out of these alternatives. That's the thing that I want to do, and that's how I want to do it. Or through habit, having developed a skill and it just being the way that I do things, but I could do it, I could focus and choose a different way to do it. Right. So I feel like compulsion is a little less intentional. Yeah. Maybe might be the best way to say it.
Just to give an example, because it helps myself usually think through these things, it's like I want and aim, practice to eat healthier, right? But every once in a while, I just have this, like, essentially it feels insatiable, right? To just eat more than 2 slices of pizza. It's like I got this pizza here, and like if I eat one, I'll be fine. Like I'll survive. So my goal is met, right? I'm not hungry anymore. If I eat 2, I'll feel a little bit more satiated. Like I'll have, done a little bit more than I probably should, but having 2, I still recognize as not being the end of like whatever diet or health plan I'm on or whatever. But then I'm like, I just feel like I can't even stop it, like a freight train coming. Like, okay, I got to eat 2 or 3 more slices before I can hang it up.
Give me that cheese and salt, baby.
Right. Exactly. And like you said, there are factors that play into that compulsion. And sometimes, like, I do feel that there's a little bit of a decision on my end. I feel in this incredible urge to eat that extra slice. But I also then just say, F it, I'm going to eat this anyway. And some compulsions are very much not like that. But I just wanted to use this pizza and poke fun at myself at the same time.
Yeah, well, and I think there's sometimes, at least I've had this experience where before I have that usually for me it's the 4th slice. Like 3 is where I should have stopped, and the 4th one's like, oh, but I just want a little bit more.
Just a little
and
bit
sometimes more. That pause happens before I eat it, and then there's deliberation, should I or shouldn't I? And sometimes I'm eating the 4th slice going, why did I do this? Like I didn't even think about it. I just like did it and was regretting it.
As you cry to yourself, but you're just like, oh, it's so good.
Right.
One other thing that you made me think about, and it's not the same as compulsion, but maybe it feels similar, is reaction.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, you and somebody are getting into an argument, right? And the low-level escalation, the reaction is to say something back, right? But as the conversation escalates more and more, at some point somebody throws a punch or something like that, and the punch feels like a reaction, and then of course there's a reaction to that punch.
Yeah, so I guess, are you asking what's the role of decision making in that, or how much of that is habit?
I think now I'm just articulating other means that are like maybe part of this decision-making tree. They're all involved in decision-making at some point, but we're just kind of teasing out the very conscious decisions from the what feels like subconscious or unconscious decisions.
Oh, good. Yeah. No, that's very helpful because I did not think of reaction as a decision usually, so it's a good contrast. Yeah. So maybe we should take all the things we've discussed this season: perspective, perception, value, desire, norms, language. Let's bring it all together and maybe look at a case study or two about decision making. What better decision to talk about in the NBA than the decision?
Ooh, finally a super episode. The decision. So we mentioned this in what was it, season 1, right?
Yeah.
We brought it up as part of narrative, and I feel like narrative is going to sneak its head in here at some point. But I just want to clarify that we're going to do our best to avoid any narrative aspects of this conversation because we're focusing on the decision making end. But just to characterize that decision really quickly, if everybody remembers, summer of 2010, LeBron was a free agent for the first time in his career, and he had the choice to go to Chicago, the Clippers, the Knicks, the Miami Heat. He could re-sign with Cleveland, and I think there was a sixth team, but I just can't remember what that team was. Did I say the Bulls?
Yeah.
Okay.
You said, yeah. Yeah, I think you got them all.
There was a 16 that just didn't have much of a chance. Maybe it was the Nets, but so that's where that stands.
Yeah, and I think just to emphasize what you already pointed out is we're not really trying to evaluate whether his decision was right or wrong, but more what were the factors that lead into making a decision like the decision, and how can we bring to bear all the different aspects of subjectivity that we've been discussing. So, let's start at the beginning. Perception. What kind of perceptual elements are coming into LeBron's decision in 2010?
Perception, when you say that from his perspective, or external perception of his decision?
I think we're trying to approach this, not that we are LeBron and know, not that he's articulated everything about making that decision, but speculate that we are in LeBron's shoes. What is it from the inside to make a decision like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, from what I remember about what was available between the cities at the time was this perception of him. He probably perceived it himself. He wants to be the greatest, right? And at that time, he recognized he didn't have any championships. And I think we all can agree that the current perception, the major general perception, media perception, is that to be the best, you have to have championships, and you have to have multiple championships. And what did LeBron say when he finally was announced with his ultimate decision spot? What was the famous line that he said that related to that perception? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
It was the counting of championships. He's like, I'm here not to win one championship, not two, yeah, not three, not four, not five, not six. He just kept going up, right? So the perception very much for him was to be the best, you have to beat the best, and you have to have championships to do so. Are there other aspects of perception for LeBron that you can think of?
Well, maybe, but I also just want to highlight, even though we're talking about these kind of sequentially, you've already brought in criteria that the norms around basketball is that to be great is to win, to help your team win championships, and there were values that were associated with that, desire, the desire that he wanted to be the greatest. Values around what that meant was team success, and then the norm of you have to win rings in order to be considered the greatest. I think perceptual elements, if we want to take it from the least metaphorical sense, he's hearing things on media, he's seeing his everyday life and the team around him in Cleveland and how difficult it's been to even just get to the finals. I think he's taking in the inputs of his current existence and state of affair, and then imagining, using his imagination to consider what it would be like in another scenario. So the perceptual elements are probably pretty introductory. It's just the inputs that are serving to that he's going to have to decide among.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like you said, the media. There was several media narratives, right? It's like not just the media narrative around him as like one of the all-time greats, but also where he should be going, and then fans also saying where he should be going. So obviously he's listening to those conversations. His agent giving him information as to like which cities can pay you X amount of dollars over X amount of years, and then how to like either maximize that, take that for whatever happens next. Then there's stuff that his family is saying and his own state of living in Cleveland, right? He's like probably one of the most wealthy people in Cleveland at this time, and he can pretty much make his own future as he sees fit. So he's kind of Thanos with the Infinity Gauntlet in this scenario.
Right. And I mean, there's other factors that he's considering. It's financials that you kind of brought up, the lives for his family. He has a wife and ends up having kids, and where are they going to grow up, and how's that going to impact them? But also, like, having grown up in Ohio, being Ohio's favorite son, like the emotive aspects of performing at home, basically, right. and being a part of that community. He was very integrated into the social political fabric of Akron and Cleveland. So if he moves away, will that continue? Do they lose that support? And he was pretty intentional about keeping the Akron stuff active, but those are things he had to consider.
Yeah, and I'll just bring this back to something I mentioned earlier, but the decision-making process, you're already weighing all these variables, not valuables. They are valuable, though. You're already weighing all these variables, and so like even editing a podcast, the making one decision or another, it's not clear cut what should or should not happen. So there's a little bit of pressure there, and for LeBron, who's literally the center of a whole lot of people's conversations, that pressure becomes both internalized and externalized. So I would even add the pressure aspect of it to his perception.
Yeah, not wanting to disappoint himself or his fan base, wanting to, the drive and ambition for being the greatest. Is that a compulsion? Is that, how did that value arise? Is an interesting story. Not that we're going to be able to generate that, but its situatedness is going to also impact what he would consider as a means of what is considered actually satisfying that ambition. Does he have to bring the championship home to Cleveland for it to be truly satisfied, or can he go win that ring anywhere? He was able to do both, right? But in the moment of 2010, he couldn't know that he was going to be able to do both.
Right. So I think we covered perception pretty well, and we've tackled values in this. Do we need to add more to the values aspect, or are we trying to do this sequentially?
No, I think we're fine. I think we're just pulling all the different stuff in. We've kind of mentioned, from his perspective, he was limited, didn't know that he would be able to both go to Miami and win rings and then come back to Cleveland and win one, and eventually Los Angeles. So he can't know the future from his perspective. He can only go based on what he knows in the moment.
Quick question for you.
Yeah.
Just to bring in some terminology from last episode, but if it's too difficult a question, feel free to just move past this. But what would you say is his perspectival horizon, because of how much of influence he has?
Yeah, that's great. So obviously, I'm not LeBron. I wasn't in his situation. We're completely speculating, but I think we can imagine him fluctuating between a very limited perspective of, let me close off all the I don't want to hear the talking heads in the media. I need to listen to just my wife and myself and maybe my mother or whatever, the family that he considers,
and his agent.
And his agent. And then let me consider the financials. Right? He could restrict his horizon very much to the kind of life that he wants to live with his family, or he could shift the horizon by saying, well, let me take a broader scope at the history of basketball, what kind of factors need to be brought into this decision in order to satisfy this bigger picture, where I do need to take into consideration what people think of me and what I do. And even himself, like, what do I value about the game? What do I think I bring to the game? If he shifts from just his livelihood concerns to like legacy concerns, I think that's a shifting horizon there.
I'm actually really glad I asked this question, because last week I was struggling to understand how somebody could go about shifting their horizon in this case. And the way you characterize it, I think this is something that we all do, maybe not daily, but when we're making big decisions for ourselves or families, we do this stuff too. Like, you're deciding to buy a house with your spouse or partner, and you're like, oh, do we go for the big house because we can afford it, or do we find something more limiting? Do I think about just me? Do I think about my partner? What if there's kids involved? Are we planning on having kids? You kind of go through these like shifts, bringing the scale in and out constantly.
Yes, yeah. And so you're imagining all your alternatives. You're reflecting on your goals and the situations in which you could achieve your goals and what it would take to accomplish them. You're interpreting the various alternatives to understand how what each of them might entail, right? Trying to project into the future the various outcomes of each of those choices. So a lot of the things that we have talked about this season on subjectivity, I think we're seeing don't come in sequentially. They're all kind of interacting together as this whole combination of thinking, of being a subject.
And okay, so I think I now understand this aspect of it. So I think you were about to say something else before I segued.
Language. I was going to bring in our topics on language because it's a topic that you and I love to discuss, and we seem to get stuck in quite often. But so far, we haven't really brought it into this decision process. So I'm interested in how LeBron, we were going to stay away from narrative, but part of it is, how did he tell the story to himself and his family? How did he sell that this is what he wanted to do to himself? And then how did he communicate and portray this to others? Well, he decided to have a big media presentation called The Decision, right? And by giving it putting the definite article in there, it gives it this momentous kind of feel. So there's a lot of emotive and conceptual apparatus going into just presenting a free agency signing as the decision, and that language plays a major factor in how he understands and represents the decision-making process.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and especially as we know about in the aftermath, right? Literally 5 other teams and markets you could extend that to, because the fans in those teams are also affected. You could take that for what you will, right? But there's like 5 other teams and markets that are going to be disappointed by the decision no matter what. And one of the most prevailing arguments after the decision was the fact that he called it the decision, right? It's like, how could you be so self-inflationary that you're like you're making one decision for one human being on the planet and calling it the decision, as if to articulate this is the most important decision that everybody will get to be a part of. And I was texting you about this, but Kevin Durant later that same offseason signed an extension with the Oklahoma City Thunder. And everybody after the decision had such a bad taste in their mouths. And I'm not trying to articulate my own personal feelings here. This is like essentially what the narrative was. Everybody after that was saying how Kevin Durant is the true hero because he's arguably the second best player in the NBA even at this ripe young age, and he is confidently signing with the team that he knows he wants to stay with. We know later on that is in fact not true, and that he does it quietly. He doesn't make a big scene about it. He just signs this extension. The Oklahoma City Thunder announce it, and that's all there is to it. And so in this way, like the media and all these losing markets essentially like paint LeBron as a villain and as Kevin Durant as a hero, just because of the simple way that the decision was made, and then Kevin Durant's the decision was made.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I thought it might be interesting to compare and contrast LeBron's the decision in 2010 pre-championship to Giannis, his loyalty and commitment to the Bucks and re-signing, which helped them bring in other players, which eventually led to him getting a chip, staying in a small market with the team that drafted him. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit, not to evaluate whether one decision was right and the other one was wrong, but just the differences, the different factors that led to their different decisions.
Yeah. So I guess we've talked about all that from the decision standpoint, and Giannis, and I think you probably are a much bigger Giannis fan than I am. You know much more about his history than I do. But so please feel free to step in any time. The way that he has articulated his own values, through the media or even quotes from himself, is mostly around loyalty and hard work. He's got that blue collar work ethic. Everybody talks like infamously about how hard he works in the gym. And I even think it was like during the final, or maybe not the finals, but during the playoffs this season, he had like one bad game and like didn't leave the arena until like 1 a.m, working on the very thing that he made like one mistake on, and was like, this is never gonna happen again.
Yeah.
Go
ahead. Well, just biographically, being on the streets in Greece and having to fend for him and his family, I think we can speculate that there is an interesting drive and ambition for someone that was a survivor, right? And the fact that he's turned that same kind of survival mindset into a scrappy work ethic, and then has this might be overstating it, but I want to say gratitude of having been drafted and this opportunity to move onto the international stage with professional sports. Like, this is an amazing financial opportunity. It's an ability to live out his dream, right? So there's this whole buildup of ambition and drive, but also humility and gratitude that factors into a very different type of personality and persona, right? So who Giannis presents as to the public is very different than who LeBron, who was raised in the spotlight and even as a teenager in junior high and high school was getting national attention for how well he played basketball, and was on the cover of Time magazine when he was 18, right? Or yeah. Not Time. Was it Time?
He was on the cover, I'm pretty sure, of Time when he, right when he got drafted, but he was on the cover of, I want to say, Sports Illustrated.
That's it.
When he was 16.
Yeah, so like a very different history. He was escalated into the national stage at a young age, had to learn how to navigate all that, and so was pretty media savvy. And so there's always been a sense of artifice around how LeBron presents himself to the public, whereas Giannis, it feels like he didn't just have us peek behind the curtain. He was like, let's take that curtain rod down, right? Like, I'm just glad to be here. You guys are part of this journey with me. And so very different attitudes and approaches, which reflects on how he goes about making decisions, right? He's got goals. He knows that it takes work to achieve them, so he develops the habits and skills to achieve them. And then just he's a very reflective individual, I think. I think the ways that he responded to the questions after winning a championship this past year reveals that he has very deep thoughts about what makes a meaningful life, what matters in life. He keeps talking about how it's a game, and if we're not having fun playing the game, it's not worth it. Like, we're not solving world hunger or something like that. And so he insists on having fun, not making the game mechanical. And so one of the strategies for the Bucks is play random, like be random, and always change it up. Don't just have your game plan going down the floor every single time. So I just feel like those kind of factors reveal someone who's going to make his decisions less on a financial and popular opinion kind of framework, and much more on what do I value in life and what will achieve those values.
Yeah, you talk about the values, and I just want to throw this in real quick because we mentioned this in our values episode. But it's not just about the values that he himself cultivated, but it's everybody, he's a product of his own upbringing and environment. Like you said, his family experienced homelessness in Greece. So one, he's from another country. He wasn't raised with the American system of values, even like regionally from Milwaukee, right? And LeBron he grew up in the United States. He actually grew up in Ohio, so he did experience poverty as well, but it was through the lens of his own community, just like Giannis was through the lens of his community in Greece. And I'm always thinking about this because refugees have a different sense of like work ethic, and it trickles down as a family value. And my wife is a product of this as well. She talks about it all the time. It's kind of funny. But you told me this story of Giannis like having shipped all his money back to his family in Greece and was like essentially broke, right? Trying to get to a Bucks game in, what was it, his rookie or sophomore year?
I think it was his second year, but it might have been his rookie year. Yeah.
And, he's like literally running to the game, and a family like sees him and is like, "Oh, you're Giannis. Why are you running in the winter?" He's like, "I need to get to this game." And they just like take him to the game. So yeah. Instead of like lavishly spending, which was the American attitude when you come across money at the time, and I'm not faulting anybody for this behavior or decision. I'm just saying that's essentially it is what it is. Call back. And Giannis had a different perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There's so many great stories about how he's adapted through, to the shift into having money, and how he's continued to reach out to the refugees, to Greek community, to Nigeria, and just a lot of different ways that he's demonstrated that recognition of how he got to the situation that he's in. But going back to the decision making for LeBron, you can speculate that he really did have a lot of live options on the table, and was probably taking them all relatively seriously. He definitely wanted to win. There had been conversations about him and Bosch teaming up in Chicago with D Rose. There was talk about maybe all three of them, Wade and Bosch, going to Chicago. There was talk about going to the Knicks, going to the Clippers, and forming super teams there, or at least taking advantage of the major market for business initiatives, right? So he had a lot of different things that he was weighing factors, but it seemed like he legitimately could have justified any of those choices, even staying in Cleveland. There was a lot of motivation and reasons to stay, which I think is why so many people in Ohio felt betrayed that he didn't, because they only saw those reasons. They didn't see the other reasons to leave. Whereas with Giannis, there were all the what ifs. What if he goes to Golden State with Curry? What if, he joins another team, super team, and gets his rings that way? Or a lot of criticism, like Giannis is a tremendous athlete, but he's got some gaps in his game, and the Bucks don't seem to be filling those gaps very well. He can't win here. It's a small market team. They're never going to be able to attract the players that they need in order to win. And Giannis could have paid attention to those narratives and said, yeah, it doesn't look like I can win here. I'm out. But instead, like, doubled down. And it almost feels like it was less of a... Like, I think definitely there was a decision. I'm sure he had to consider his alternatives. But it certainly felt less like he was seriously ever considering going. It was more like, I want to be here. Can you as an organization, Milwaukee, help make my decision easier by saying that you're committing to me the same way that I'm committing to you?
I'm pretty sure that after he signed that extension, he actually said that he wanted to be in Milwaukee for the rest of his career, which just kind of shows that level of commitment and loyalty that he has. But also, I mean, I don't think you make that kind of a statement without thinking that, like, maybe this decision is not as complicated as other decisions I've made in the past or other people are making, right? It's like not the same situation. Like you said, for him it was what if scenarios, and everybody is like around the league is basically watching if he signs this extension. then I don't need to worry about free agent money for the next couple of years because he's not available, right? But if he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't, now I have to change everything I'm doing as a franchise to make sure. And so for these franchises, it's harder for them because they're waiting on this decision. But for him, it's like, well, I don't really want to play with anybody else because they're not the level that I think they should be. Or, I think I have everything I need right here and right now. Whereas with LeBron, right, he very much was looking at all the different places that he could go and all the different scenarios that those places could do. I remember it being part of the Bulls and the Heat and the Knicks' pitch at the very least of like essentially saying like, here's what we can offer you, and also we are offering that when you come, you can pretty much get any player in the league to join, and you just tell us who and we'll make it happen. Like, so he's kind of receiving the same exact scenario in different marketplaces. And then now the decision isn't just about the team, but there's all this other stuff that now I can fantasize about because it's not just about basketball. Like, basketball is the same in all these places.
Right. No, that's a good point. So with those kind of analyses, again, we're doing a lot of speculation. We're not LeBron. We're not Giannis. But to kind of tie this up. Stop imagining. No. So to tie this kind of up, I know that you've been wanting to get to the topic of decision making all season, rearing to go, and to talk about learning. So here's your pitch to talk about learning and why decision making is important.
Oh, I didn't think this would be called the Anyhoney podcast today. I guess real quick, just to wrap up the decision, because we haven't actually said it yet. He chose Miami, right? Mm-hmm. We know that was the case. The thing that I constantly think about when it comes to decision making, we talked about how the values weigh into it, and I don't know if this is true or not, but my sense is that the values are probably the most heavily influenced aspect of it. Because they kind of like trickle throughout, right? Like the values influence the language, which influences the actual decisions that you can make. It influences the evaluation. You could even say it skews the evaluation, right? You don't really think about things that aren't outside of your value system. You kind of just turn those into negatives unless somebody presents it to you in a way that more aligns with your values. But even then, it's still skewing towards your values in that way.
Right.
But just going down further, right? When we talked about Giannis, you talked about the putting in, like using the values to develop the habits that you use that essentially further reinforce those values, but maybe they're the outcomes of those values. And so even then, the values are still affecting the outcome through the habituation, right? You want to get better at playing basketball. You want to get better at dribbling the ball. So you practice things that do that for you. You also practice skills that help you practice doing that for you. Like getting up earlier so that you can start practicing dribbling a basketball at 6 a.m. instead of doing it, at school or after school or whatever the case is. So I don't think that decisions, they feel so isolated for us because we're just like, oh, this is going to happen, so I'm going to do this. But there's so much influence there. And it wasn't until this season, really, that I started thinking about how crucial normativity and values are, especially, into that decision-making process. And maybe we'll talk about this at the very end, about how that might affect the learning, or the other way around.
Yeah, good. I know that we've discussed various free will positions in the first season and really didn't come down on any of them because I think I won't speak for you. I think we've talked about this and have similar views, but certainly I lean towards the idea that we might live in a deterministic universe and yet can't accept it in a certain way. And so I keep hoping against hope and trying to find avenues to explain and account for agency and voluntarism, having some kind of free will. So that being said, when I think about decision making and learning, I automatically orient it in a free will kind of environment. not that we have total control over our will in all aspects, and that everything is a deliberate decision, but that because we can reflect and double our situation and learn from our situation, I do think it gives us some ability to plan ahead, to develop skills and habits, and to think about our values and reorient our values so that maybe our reactions will be geared towards the outcomes that we want instead of just whatever instinctively would happen.
And you said you wouldn't speak for me. I had to, sorry.
That's good.
Right there, you just made me think about, we didn't really bring this up, but it feels super obvious now that even language is decision making. Going from the point, which direction to look, right? You have to learn that stuff before you do it, but you also learn that somebody can interpret that and reflect on it. But then you also learn that you can reflect on it and interpret it, and then you start to learn about the behaviors of people when you do things. I talked about babies experiments last week, and it was just thinking about when babies first learn to speak, they're kind of just saying sounds until words form. And I don't know if there's ever been research on this, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were. But like this small theory that I have is that like babies just put together the right combinations of sounds. Like it always starts simple, right? The first words are usually like dada or mama or ow or something like that. That's a very simple sound. And because we have context around that, the baby recognizes that based on our reactions that they've done something in a positive manner. And so that behavior gets reinforced. And so that's how they start learning new words. And eventually they pick up, they're able to interpret the actual sounds that we make, and they're able to repeat those sounds. And then they start learning, like, now it's not just repetition, but they can also chain them together, so they're not just saying the same sounds, but they're doing new combinations of sounds until it makes sense to others. And you say a new word that I've never heard before, and usually the process is like, okay, let me try and repronounce that word so I know the word, and then let me try and infer the definition, and if I can't do that, then I can just straight up ask, like, what does that mean? You can explain it to me, and now I have like a new word tool in my arsenal for communication. But it doesn't even have to be words, right? You can give me this happens all the time. We have ESP on this podcast because I'm actually watching you for your reactions, and you're watching me. And it actually happened earlier today where I kind of just left it hanging, and I was like, I'm pretty sure Corbin is going to say this if I stop it here, and I want you to say that. And so I did, and then you did, and I was like, I didn't jump for joy, but I really wanted to.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that because we do a lot of this, people probably know because of all the rambling that we do, but we don't write up a script in advance, right? So a lot of the way that the conversation shapes is because we're anticipating where each other wants to go, not because we have it all written out. So that's a great thing about our camaraderie, but also I think it points out about learning how there can be a deliberative aspect to decision making, and also impulses do factor in, happy accidents do factor in, right? In the child development process, there's a lot of learning from mistakes. There's a lot of just experimentation. Let me try this and see what happens. And we do this as adults, right? Some of us are more adventurous and more willing to take risk and make mistakes, and therefore learn from them. And others, learn strategies to avoid mistakes and maybe a little bit more restrained in the kind of risks that they'll take, but they still have to reflect on the strategies in order to reduce those risks, right? So in either approach, there's a learning capacity that's being developed.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know that this is the last episode, and we've made a lot of decisions to come to this point. But the thing that I want to ask you is, so to me, this season has really been, I think it started about learning, but it really was, to me, about understanding experience. Did you have a similar interpretation?
Yes, yeah. I know that ultimately our goal when we even started episode 1 of season 1 was we wanted to talk about artificial intelligence. How are we going to get there? And we've gone all kinds of different routes, and every time felt like we're not quite ready to talk. I feel like this season's discussion on subjectivity and the components of experience has laid a good groundwork for a lot of the things that we take as givens or as assumed boundaries when we're talking about intelligence and artificial intelligence. So just in the future, I think if however many seasons we decide to go this season here, we'll probably have a lot of episodes that we'll refer back to.
Yeah, you just kind of wrapped that up really nicely. And I think one of the constructs that I have when thinking about intelligence is that it happens in different ways at different levels for different organisms and structures, and maybe there's like other things, entities that think or have intelligence that we can't quite quantify. Popular theories like the universe or the solar system or whatever. I'm not going to go so far as to say that. But throughout this season, I think you could easily say that there are exhibitions of all of the topics that we talked about throughout at least the life here on Earth, right? And I'm not going to say that they're all full-blown intelligence, but there's definitely, to me, a spectra of intelligence, right? Of things being able to experience, and I don't think we're still at the root of what experience is, but I hope, at least I feel that I have a much deeper grasp, and I have better tools at least now to understand what experience is going forward.
Nice. Yeah, and we've definitely been focused on the human experience, or human experiences. Maybe there isn't a the human experience. But I hope that we've been able to talk in enough generality that it would apply to most intelligences in general. Like normativity I don't see any reason why it requires the human physiology to be important to thinking. Same things for something like a perspective, for horizons of understanding, for interpretation. Imagination, I feel like, should transcend the human experience, but maybe it requires some kind of finitude of perspective. So maybe a non localizable entity that has like a spread out mind might have a different approach to imagination, for instance, or reflection. But I'm just throwing that out there. I do feel like we've tried to talk about beyond the human notion of experience.
Yeah, and I don't want to get preachy, but I'll just say this quickly. You mentioned this way earlier in the season when talking about qualia, right? Us being able to essentially like communicate with each other because we have some sort of inference over shared experience. I understand physically that it might not be the same as your experience, but because I have experienced something like that, then I can I have a grounding point, an anchor point as to what it's like for you, and so then I can empathize. And I just hope that going forward, you, me, our listeners, can start to expand on this idea outside of ourselves, right? Just because we don't have that shared experience with dogs or dolphins or yeast cells, that it's like that they don't have these types of things, these qualia themselves. And so then I think when we start with that point, I think we can start to build up on this idea of like, do these other creatures experience? Do other things experience? And then do they exhibit intelligence?
Excellent.